"We don't serve women like you," he said. And the room followed with laughter that felt older than the
I
walls
know what you
themselves.
did.
The kind of
You got no
laughter that
proof.
decided who belonged
Please, not
and
in
who
here.
didn't long
Stay out
before
of
a
this,
word
man.
was spoken.
You got no
Eleanor
right!
Whitlock stood
Stop
just
it,
inside
both
the
of you!
doorway. The late afternoon
looking for
sun
someone,
still
a
clinging to
man.
the dust on
Ain't
her
seen
dress.
no one new, ma'am,
Her
not
boots
today.
worn from
He was
miles
here.
of road
I
that
know
didn't
it.
care who you
Ain't
were
no one here
or
by
where you
that
came
name,
from.
miss.
And she
You
didn't
best
step
be on your
back,
way now.
didn't lower her eyes, didn't offer an apology for existing. Where she clearly wasn't wanted, the saloon smelled of whiskey, leather, and heat trapped under a low ceiling. Voices bouncing off rough timber like they owned the air, and Harold Boone leaned on the counter as if the whole town rested on his elbows, his smile thin and practiced, meant to cut without ever needing to raise a hand. "You lost, ma'am," he added, slower this time, drawing it out so the men at the tables could savor it. And someone shifted a chair just to get a better look at her, while another muttered something under his breath that earned a few more chuckles. Eleanor took one step forward, then another, each footfall quiet against the wooden floor, measured, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world, even if the room wanted her gone in less than a minute. And when she spoke, her voice didn't fight for space. It simply existed, calm and steady. "Just a glass of water," she said. Nothing more, nothing less. Boone tilted his head, amused now, as if the request itself was part of the joke, and he looked around to make sure everyone was watching, to make sure the moment landed the way he intended, because in Red Hollow, moments like this were currency, and humiliation paid well. "You hear that?" he said to the room, tapping the counter once with his knuckle. "She thinks this is a place for charity." And the laughter came again, louder, easier, rolling through the saloon like a tide that didn't ask permission. Eleanor didn't react, not to the words, not to the laughter, not even when a man near the window leaned back and shook his head as if he'd seen this story before and already knew how it ended. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her coat, slow enough that a few eyes narrowed, curious now, not threatened, just interested in how far she'd go before breaking. And she placed something small on the counter between them, a worn piece of silver that caught the light for just a second before settling into stillness. Boone glanced down, barely giving it a second thought, his smirk returning like it had never left, and he pushed it back toward her with 2 fingers, careless, dismissive. "You think that buys you anything here?" he said, his voice lower now, almost bored, like the moment had already run its course. Outside, a horse shifted in the street, the faint jingle of reins cutting through the noise for half a heartbeat before disappearing again. And somewhere near the door, a man stopped laughing first, not because he understood why, but because something in the air had changed in a way he couldn't explain. Eleanor's hand rested near the silver, but she didn't take it back, didn't insist, didn't argue. She simply looked at Boone the same way she had since she walked in, steady, unblinking, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond that room. And then the door behind her creaked open, slow enough to be noticed, quiet enough to matter, and for the first time since she stepped inside, the saloon began to fall silent, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a storm rolling in without a single drop of rain yet touching the ground. The hinges gave a low, tired groan as the door opened wider, and the last threads of laughter unraveled into something thinner, something uncertain, while boots crossed the threshold with a rhythm that did not rush and did not hesitate, each step landing like it already knew where it belonged. Caleb Thornridge moved through the doorway without looking left or right, his coat carrying the dust of 20 hard miles and a silence that did not need to introduce itself, and a few men near the bar straightened without meaning to, their hands drifting away from cards, from glasses, from anything that might make noise. Harold Boone did not move at first, not because he was unafraid, but because men like him had built a life on never being the first to react, his eyes narrowing just enough to measure, to weigh, to decide if this was something to dismiss or something to manage. And for a second longer than comfort allowed, he chose to smirk again, though it did not sit quite as easily on his face as before. Caleb stopped 3 steps from the counter, close enough to see the grain of the wood, close enough to see the small piece of silver resting there, and his gaze dropped to it without a word, the way a man notices something that matters before anyone else has decided it does. The room held its breath in pieces, one table at a time, one man at a time. until even the sound of the horse outside faded into the background like it had been pushed there on purpose. Eleanor Whitlock did not turn around, not even when the air shifted behind her, her posture unchanged, her hand still resting near the badge she had placed on the counter, as if the moment unfolding had been expected, not hoped for. And Boone finally let out a short laugh that tried to pull the room back under his control. "You planning to order something, or just stand there tracking dust in?" he said, louder than necessary. The edge in his voice sharpened now, trying to reclaim the ground that had begun to slip. Caleb did not answer right away, and that delay stretched, thin and tight, until Boone's fingers tapped once against the counter, a habit that had always filled silence before, but now only made it more obvious. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying, just far enough to reach every corner without rising. "That piece," he said, nodding slightly toward the silver. "You should not have touched it." And it was not a threat, not a warning, just a statement placed carefully between them. Boone's smirk flickered, not gone, but no longer certain, and he leaned forward just a fraction, as if proximity might restore authority. "It is just metal," he replied, quick, dismissive, though his eyes had already begun to search the room for agreement that did not come. Caleb reached out then, not fast, not slow, and lifted the badge from the counter with a steadiness that drew every gaze back to his hand, turning it once between his fingers so the worn engraving caught the lamplight again, clearer this time, undeniable, and a man near the door shifted his weight, the floorboard beneath him creaking loud in the quiet. Eleanor watched from the corner of her eye, not moving, not speaking, while Boone opened his mouth to add something, anything that might anchor the moment back in his favor, but the words did not line up the way they had before, did not come as easily as they always had. And for the first time that day, he realized the room was no longer listening to him. The silver turned once more between Caleb Thornridge's fingers, slow enough for the lamplight to settle into every worn edge. And when he lifted his eyes again, they did not search the room. They landed exactly where they needed to, on Harold Boone, who now stood a little too still behind his own counter, as if movement itself had become a decision he was not ready to make. "You ever see one of these issued before?" Caleb asked, not raising his voice, not pressing, just placing the question in the space between them, and it hung there heavier than any accusation, because everyone in that room understood what it meant to be asked something simple and realized too late that the answer mattered. Boone let out a short breath that tried to sound like a laugh, but it came thinner, less certain, and he wiped his hand once along the edge of the counter, a habit he had when buying time. "I see a lot of things come through here," he said, shrugging one shoulder, casual on the surface, but his eyes flicked to the badge and away again too quickly. "Does not make them important." And a man at the far table shifted in his seat, the scrape of wood against floor carrying farther than it should have in a room that quiet. Caleb nodded once, as if that answer had been expected, and he stepped closer by a single pace, the distance closing not in threat, but in clarity. "This one is," he said, turning the badge so. The engraving faced Boone directly, the letters catching light, sharp now, readable even from a few feet away, and for the first time, Boone leaned forward without meaning to, his eyes narrowing as he tried to focus, to confirm what his instincts had already begun to warn him about. Eleanor Whitlock did not move, but there was a subtle shift in the way she stood, as if the weight she had been carrying alone had just been set down beside her, not gone, but no longer hers to hold by herself, and she watched the reflection of the badge in the polished wood rather than the men speaking over it. "Deputy authorization," Caleb continued, each word placed carefully, not rushed. "Filed 2 weeks ago, signed under my office," and he did not need to say more than that, because the meaning traveled faster than explanation, passing from one man to another in the room, quiet, invisible, undeniable, until even those who did not understand the law understood the shift. Boone's mouth opened, ready to answer, to deny, to laugh it off the way he always had, but the words hesitated, catching somewhere between certainty and doubt, and his gaze moved past Caleb for a fraction of a second, searching the room again. But this time the room did not return anything to him. No smiles, no nods, just waiting. "You are saying she is," he began, but the sentence did not finish, because finishing it would make it real, and real things could not be pushed aside with a joke. Caleb did not rescue him from that pause, did not soften it. He simply lowered the badge back onto the counter with a quiet, deliberate motion, the sound of metal touching wood louder than it should have been. "I am saying," he replied, steady, "that you turned away someone who does not need your permission to stand in this room." And the words did not rise, did not fall. They settled, firm as ground underfoot. Boone swallowed once, his throat tightening in a way he had not felt in years, and he reached for something to hold on to, a glass, a rag, anything. But his hand stopped halfway, hovering, uncertain, because every movement now felt like it would be seen for what it was. And Eleanor finally lifted her gaze from the counter, not to challenge, not to accuse, but simply to look at him, calm and unwavering, as if nothing about this moment surprised her at all. And in that quiet, with every eye in the room no longer on him but through him, Harold Boone understood something he had never needed to understand before, that control, once broken, does not come back the same way, and sometimes it does not come back at all. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the room like something alive, something watching, and Harold Boone felt it settle on his shoulders in a way he could not shake off, the weight of eyes no longer friendly, no longer entertained, but measuring him now the way he had measured others for years. His hand finally found the edge of the counter, fingers curling around the worn wood as if it could steady him, as if it could remind him that this was still his place, his rules, his voice that carried weight in this town. But when he tried to speak again, the words came slower, thicker, as though they had to pass through something unseen before reaching the air. "If she is under your authority," he said, choosing each word carefully now, "then she should have said so." And it sounded reasonable, almost, until it did not, until the room itself seemed to question why that would have mattered at all. Caleb Thornridge did not move, did not lean in, did not raise his voice. He simply watched Boone the way a man watches a storm pass after it has already done its damage. "She asked for water," he replied, quiet, certain, and there was no space in that sentence for anything else, no argument, no interpretation, just a fact that had been ignored. Boone's jaw tightened, and for a brief second, something familiar returned to his posture, that old instinct to push back, to reassert, to remind everyone why they listened to him in the first place. "This is my establishment," he said, straighter now, though the edge had dulled. "I decide who gets served." And a few heads in the room nodded out of habit more than conviction. But even that small support faded quickly when no one else followed. Eleanor Whitlock shifted her weight slightly, the faint sound of her boot against the floor drawing attention not because it was loud, but because it was the only sound that dared interrupt the moment. And she looked at Boone not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far steadier, something that did not rise or fall with the room's opinion. "And you decided," she said, her voice even, clear, without knowing anything at all. And the words did not accuse, they revealed, and that difference cut deeper than any raised voice could have. Boone opened his mouth again, but this time it was not just the room that held him, it was the realization threading through his thoughts, slow and unavoidable, that the ground he stood on had shifted beneath him, and he had not felt it until it was too late, that the laughter he had relied on had turned into silence, and silence did not belong to him. Caleb reached forward and placed the badge back on the counter, not as a symbol now, but as a conclusion, his hand resting beside it for a brief moment before pulling away. "You still get to decide," he said, calm, almost gentle. "That has not changed." And Boone's eyes flicked up, searching for the trap, for the angle, for the part where this turned back in his favor. But Caleb continued before he could find it. "What has changed is who is watching you make that decision." And that was when it settled fully, not as a threat, not as a command, but as truth. The men in the room did not look away, not this time, and even those who had laughed before now sat with their hands still, their expressions unreadable, waiting not for a show, but for an answer. Boone's fingers loosened on the counter, then tightened again, and he reached for a glass without thinking. The motion slower than it had ever been, deliberate now, careful, as if each inch of movement mattered more than the last. and he set it down in front of Eleanor with a sound that echoed louder than it should have in a room that had forgotten how to breathe, then turned to the water barrel behind him, his back to the crowd for the first time that day. And as he filled the glass, the small, steady stream was the only sound left in the saloon, simple, undeniable, and final. The stream of water slowed, then stopped, and for a moment Harold Boone did not turn around, his hand still resting on the handle, as if letting go of it would mean letting go of something larger, something he had carried for years without ever noticing its weight. And when he finally faced the room again, the glass in his hand felt heavier than it should have, simple as it was. He set it down in front of Eleanor Whitlock with care that did not match the man they all thought they knew, and the faint clink against the wood marked the end of something none of them could quite name. Eleanor looked at the glass for a second, not reaching for it immediately, her reflection faint in the surface of the water, steady, unchanged, as if nothing that had just happened had altered her in any way. And then she lifted it, her fingers calm, her movement unhurried, taking a small sip that carried no triumph, no challenge, only completion. The room watched, not because they expected more, but because they did not know how to look away now that everything had shifted, and a man near the back cleared his throat quietly before deciding against saying anything at all. Caleb Thornridge stepped back half a pace, giving space not out of retreat, but out of respect for a moment that did not belong to him, his eyes moving briefly across the room, taking in each face, each lowered gaze, each silent acknowledgement of what had just taken place without a single raised voice. Boone's hands rested on the counter again, but they did not grip it the same way, his fingers looser now, uncertain, and he glanced at the badge where it still lay between them, no longer a small piece of metal, but something that had revealed more than he had intended to show. And he swallowed once before speaking, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the sharp edge that had once defined it. "I did not know," he said, and it sounded less like an excuse and more like a realization spoken too late. Eleanor lowered the glass back onto the counter, the remaining water barely disturbed, and she met his eyes for the first time since he had spoken those earlier words, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that did not ask for apology and did not offer forgiveness, only truth. "You did not ask," she replied, and the difference settled deeper than anything else that had been said. Boone nodded once, slow, almost to himself, as if turning that sentence over in his mind and finding no way around it. And for a long second, no one moved, no one spoke, the saloon holding onto the silence like it had finally learned its value. Outside, the light had begun to shift toward evening, a softer glow pushing through the doorway, catching dust in the air and turning it into something almost visible, almost tangible, and Eleanor reached for the badge at last, lifting it from the counter and slipping it back into her pocket with the same quiet certainty she had shown from the moment she stepped inside. Caleb watched her for a brief moment, then inclined his head slightly, not as an order, not as a signal, but as recognition, and she returned it just as subtly before turning toward the door. The sound of her boots against the floor was the only thing that followed her now, steady, unchallenged, and as she stepped out into the fading light, no one tried to stop her, no one called after her. And behind her, in a room that had once thrived on noise, Harold Boone stood without speaking, the weight of his own silence settling in where his voice used to be, and for the first time, it was not something he could control. The door closed behind Eleanor Whitlock with a soft, final sound that did not echo, and yet it seemed to carry farther than anything that had been said inside, lingering in the minds of those who remained as the last trace of her presence disappeared into the fading light. For a long moment, no one moved, not because they were told to stay still, but because something in the room had shifted beyond habit, beyond routine, and even the air felt different, heavier, as if it now held memory where before it had only held noise. Harold Boone stood behind the counter, his hands resting flat against the wood, the same position he had taken 100 times before, but now it felt unfamiliar, like standing in a place that looked the same but no longer belonged to him in the way it once had. He glanced toward the door, just once, as if expecting it to open again, as if expecting to be given another chance to speak differently, to act differently, but the street outside remained quiet, the soft, orange glow of dusk stretching across the ground without interruption. Caleb Thornridge remained where he was for a few seconds longer, his gaze following the same path Eleanor had taken, then slowly returning to the room, taking in the men who now avoided his eyes, who shifted in their seats, who suddenly found interest in empty glasses and worn tabletops. No one laughed now. No one offered a comment to break the silence, because they understood, in a way they had not before, that some moments did not need words to be understood. Boone exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and reached for the glass Eleanor had used, staring at the small amount of water left inside, as if it held an answer he had missed, something simple that had passed him by while he was too busy deciding who mattered and who did not. She did not raise her voice, he said at last, not to Caleb, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, as if speaking it aloud might help him understand it. And Caleb's reply came just as quietly, she did not need to. And that was all. No explanation, no lesson, just a truth placed where it could not be ignored. Boone nodded once, slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass before setting it down again. Careful this time, deliberate, as though every action now required thought, required awareness of how it would be seen, how it would be remembered. A man near the window finally stood, adjusting his hat. But instead of making a joke or calling for another drink, he simply placed a few coins on the table and walked out, followed by another, and then another, not in a rush, not in protest, but in quiet acknowledgement that something had changed and they were not the same men who had laughed just minutes before. Caleb turned toward the door at last, pausing only briefly beside the counter, his hand resting on the wood for a second, not as a claim, but as a reminder, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady. "It is a small town," he said. "People remember how they are treated." And Boone did not answer, because he already knew, already felt it settling in, that this moment would not fade the way others had, that it would stay, carried in quiet conversations and unspoken looks, shaping the way the room filled again tomorrow and the day after that. Caleb stepped outside without another word, leaving the saloon behind him in a silence that no one rushed to fill, and Boone remained where he was, the familiar space around him now marked by something he could not undo, something that did not shout, did not demand, but stayed, steady and undeniable, like the echo of a voice that had chosen not to be raised. The street outside carried the slow rhythm of evening settling in, boots against dust, the distant creak of a wagon wheel, the low murmur of voices that did not yet know what had just unfolded behind those wooden walls. And Eleanor Whitlock walked through it without hurry, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, as if the weight of the town had never tried to press against her in the first place. The sky stretched wide above her, painted in fading gold and soft blue, the kind of sky that made everything feel smaller beneath it. And she did not look back at the saloon, not once, because whatever had happened inside had already taken its place where it belonged, behind her, not ahead. A few people on the street glanced her way, some with curiosity, some with recognition they could not quite explain, as if something about her presence carried a quiet authority that did not need to be announced. And a boy near the hitching post paused mid-step, watching her pass with the kind of attention that comes without judgment, only observation. Caleb Thornridge stepped out a few moments later, the door closing behind him with that same low sound. And he stood there for a second, letting his eyes adjust to the open light, the wider world beyond the narrow walls of the saloon, before his gaze found Eleanor already halfway down the street. He did not call out to her, did not quicken his pace to catch up, he simply walked, his steps measured, matching the rhythm of the town rather than interrupting it, and after a short distance, he came alongside her without a word, the two of them moving in quiet understanding that did not require conversation to hold. "You could have said it sooner," he remarked after a while, his voice low, not accusing, not questioning, just placing the thought into the open air between them. And Eleanor kept her eyes forward, the faintest hint of a smile touching her expression before fading again. "It would not have changed him," she replied, her tone even, certain, and there was no pride in it, only clarity. Caleb nodded once, accepting that answer without pushing further, because he understood something many men did not. That truth did not need to be repeated to be real, and sometimes it needed to arrive exactly when it did to be seen at all. behind them. The saloon door opened again, and a couple of men stepped out, their voices quieter now, their laughter absent, replaced by something more thoughtful, something that lingered in the way they adjusted their hats and glanced back before moving on, as if carrying a piece of that silence with them into the night. Eleanor slowed near the edge of the street where her horse stood tied, the animal lifting its head as she approached, recognizing her. Without hesitation, and she rested a hand along its neck, grounding herself in something familiar, something that did not shift with the opinions of others. Caleb stopped a few feet away, giving her space once more, his presence steady but unobtrusive, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the sounds of the town filling in around them, distant, ordinary, unchanged. "You will be here long?" he asked finally, not out of concern, but out of simple curiosity, and Eleanor shook her head, slightly, her gaze lifting to the horizon where the last light of day met the land. "Long enough," she answered, and that was all, because time, like everything else, would take care of itself. She reached into her coat, feeling the familiar weight of the badge resting where she had placed it, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of something quieter, something steadier, and as she mounted her horse, the town continued around her, unaware that something within it had shifted in a way that could not be seen, only felt, carried forward in the choices yet to be made by those who had witnessed what silence could do when it finally spoke, without a single raised voice. The horse shifted under Eleanor Whitlock as she settled into the saddle, leather creaking softly, the familiar weight of the reins grounding her in a world that made more sense than the one she had just stepped out of, and for a moment she sat there without moving, watching the last stretch of sunlight fade across Red Hollow like a quiet farewell that asked nothing in return. The town continued around her in small, ordinary ways, a lantern being lit inside a storefront, a door closing somewhere down the street, a pair of voices exchanging words too low to carry. But beneath it all, there was something different now, something subtle that could not be named but could be felt, like a pause between breaths that lingered just a little longer than before. Caleb Thornridge remained where he stood, a few feet back, his presence steady as the fading light, and he watched her not as someone needing protection, not as someone requiring guidance, but as someone who had already chosen her path and walked it without hesitation, and there was a quiet respect in that distance, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud. Eleanor adjusted her grip on the reins, her fingers brushing briefly against the edge of her coat where the badge rested, and she did not take it out, did not look at it again, because whatever it had needed to do, it had already done, and the rest belonged to the town now, to the memory of a moment that would carry itself forward without her. "You knew it would turn," Caleb said after a while, his voice low, not seeking confirmation but offering observation, and Eleanor tilted her head slightly, considering the words before answering. "No," she said, calm and certain. "I knew it would be seen." And the difference settled between them like something solid, something that did not shift with opinion or time. A wagon rolled slowly past at the far end of the street, its wheels turning steady against the packed dirt, and the driver glanced in their direction before looking away, not out of indifference, but out of a quiet understanding that some moments were not meant to be interrupted, only witnessed. Behind them, the saloon door opened once more, and Harold Boone stepped out, the familiar shape of him now carrying something less certain, less defined, and he paused just outside, his gaze drifting down the street until it found Eleanor on her horse, not hidden, not gone, still within sight. And for a second, he looked as though he might call out, might try to bridge the distance with words he had not found earlier, but nothing came, and instead, he stood there, the weight of silence settling where his voice had once filled every space. Eleanor noticed him then, not turning fully, not making a show of it, just a slight shift of her eyes, enough to acknowledge, enough to recognize, and there was no challenge in it, no invitation, only the same steady presence she had carried from the beginning. Boone lowered his gaze first, not in defeat, not in shame alone, but in something quieter, something closer to understanding, and he rested his hand briefly against the doorframe before stepping back inside. The movement small, but final in its own way. Caleb exhaled softly, almost a breath he had not realized he was holding, and he looked toward Eleanor once more. "It will stay with him," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and she gave the slightest nod, her eyes returning to the horizon where night was beginning to take its place. "It should," she replied, and with that, she nudged the horse forward, the animal stepping into motion with quiet obedience, carrying her down the road that led out of town, while behind her, Red Hollow remained, unchanged in its buildings, its streets, its dust, but not the same in the way it would remember, in the way it would look at the next person who walked through that saloon door and asked for something as simple as a glass of water. The road out of Red Hollow stretched long and quiet, the dust rising in soft clouds beneath the steady rhythm of Eleanor Whitlock's horse, each step carrying her farther from the voices that had tried to define her and closer to the open land that asked no questions at all, and the last light of day followed her just long enough to turn the horizon into a thin line of gold before fading into the deep blue of night. She did not look back, not because she refused to remember, but because she understood that what mattered was already left behind where it could grow into something else, something beyond her control, beyond her need to witness it. The wind moved gently across the plains, brushing against her coat, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and for a while, the only sound was the slow, even breathing of the horse beneath her, steady, reliable, unbothered by the weight of human pride and quiet reckonings. Back in town, the saloon doors opened and closed with less certainty than before, each new arrival stepping inside with a glance that lingered just a moment longer, as if the room itself had changed shape without moving a single wall, and Harold Boone stood behind the counter once more, but not the same way he had that afternoon, his posture straighter yet more restrained, his voice lower when he spoke, measured in a way that had not been necessary before. A man approached the counter, hat in hand, and asked for a drink, his tone neutral, ordinary, but Boone did not answer immediately, not because he did not hear, but because he had learned something in the space of a single moment that now stretched into every decision he made, and he poured the drink without comment, setting it down carefully, his eyes briefly meeting the man's before moving on. The room filled again, slowly, but the laughter did not return the same way. It came softer, shorter, checked by something unspoken that moved between the men like a quiet agreement, and every so often, someone would glance toward the door as if expecting it to open again, as if expecting a reminder of what had already been shown. Outside, Caleb Thornridge walked the length of the street once more, his boots steady against the dirt, his gaze moving across the town not with ownership, but with awareness, and he paused near the edge where the road disappeared into open land, looking out toward the distance where Eleanor had gone, already beyond sight, already part of something wider than the town could hold. He did not follow, because he knew some paths were meant to be walked alone, and some lessons were meant to stay behind where they could take root. Inside the saloon, Boone reached for a glass, his hand steady now, and as he filled it, the sound of water carried through the room again. Simple, familiar, but no longer unnoticed, and when he set it down, he did so with care that did not ask for approval, did not seek to prove anything, only to be done right. The night settled fully over Red Hollow, lanterns casting warm light through dusty windows, shadows stretching long across the street, and somewhere in that quiet, in the spaces between words and glances, something new began to take shape, not loud, not declared, but present, like a memory that would not fade, guiding the next moment and the one after that, until even those who had laughed first would find themselves choosing differently, not because they were told to, but because they had seen what silence could reveal when it was finally given the space to be heard. Morning came to Red Hollow without announcement, the lights slipping over rooftops and into the street as if nothing had happened the day before, and yet the town did not wake the same way, not entirely, because something had settled into its bones overnight, something quiet that could not be shaken off with routine. Harold Boone stood behind the counter before the doors even opened, his hands resting on the wood, the same position he had taken for years, but now there was a pause in him, a space between thought and action that had not existed before, and when he reached for the first glass of the day, he did so with care that felt unfamiliar, as though he was learning the motion again from the beginning. The door opened slowly, and a man stepped inside, hat low, boots carrying the dust of early work, and he hesitated just a fraction longer than he normally would, his eyes moving across the room as if expecting to find something different, something out of place. But the tables were the same, the chairs unchanged, the bar still worn in all the familiar spots. Only Boone was different, though it was not something that could be pointed to directly. Not in the way a broken chair or a shattered window could be seen. It was in the way he waited, in the way he did not speak first, in the way he allowed the man to step fully inside before asking, "What can I get you?" And even that simple question carried a tone that had shifted, softer, more measured, as if it now passed through something unseen before reaching the air. The man ordered, and Boone poured, the sound of liquid filling the glass steady and clear, and when he set it down, he did not slide it across the counter. He placed it, careful, deliberate, and the man nodded once, not saying anything more, but something in that small exchange lingered, as though both of them understood it meant more than it should. Outside, Caleb Thornridge moved through the town with the same steady pace, his presence unchanged, but the way people looked at him had shifted, not out of fear, not out of deference alone, but with a quiet acknowledgement that he had not needed to raise his voice to be heard, and that truth carried weight in a place where loud words had always come easy. A woman passed by the saloon, pausing for just a second at the door before continuing on, and no one called after her. No voice rose to question her presence. No laughter followed, and though it was a small moment, it did not go unnoticed by those who saw it. Boone watched from inside, his gaze lingering on the doorway before returning to the counter, and he reached for another glass, wiping it slowly, thoughtfully, as if each movement now held meaning, as if each choice mattered in a way it had not before. The town went on, wagons rolled, voices rose and fell, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as it always had. But beneath it all, there was a difference, something subtle but steady, like a line that had been drawn and crossed, leaving behind a mark that would not fade easily. And somewhere beyond the edge of that town, beyond the reach of its voices and its memories, Eleanor Whitlock rode on without looking back, carrying nothing from Red Hollow except what she had already known before she arrived, that respect was not something given by a room full of people, and it was not something taken by force. It was something revealed, quietly, in the moment when someone chose to stand without asking permission and let the world decide what to do with that truth. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different, yet something in Red Hollow moved with a quieter rhythm, as though the town had learned to listen between its own words, and Harold Boone found himself noticing things he had long ignored. The way a man hesitated before stepping inside, the way a woman walking past the saloon door no longer quickened her pace, the way silence now carried more weight than the loudest laugh ever had. He stood behind the counter as he always did, but the space in front of him felt wider, not in distance, but in meaning, and each person who approached brought with them a moment that required more than habit, more than assumption. One afternoon, a young woman entered, her clothes plain, her expression cautious, and for a brief second, the room shifted, not in laughter this time, but in memory, and Boone felt it too, that echo of something not long past, something that had changed the way eyes moved, the way thoughts formed before words. He did not speak right away, not because he hesitated in doubt, but because he allowed the moment to exist fully before responding, and when he did, his voice carried none of the sharp edge it once had. "What can I get you?" he said, steady, even, and the woman seemed surprised, not by the question, but by the absence of anything behind it, no judgment, no measure, just the offer itself. She asked for water, simple, quiet, and Boone nodded once, turning to the barrel, the familiar motion now, carrying a different kind of awareness, as if he understood that this small act held more than its weight in ounces, more than the simple need it fulfilled. As he poured, the sound of water filled the space again, clear and steady, and a man at one of the tables glanced over, then backed down, not out of disinterest, but out of recognition that something had been learned, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Outside, Caleb Thornridge paused near the edge of town, his gaze moving across the buildings, the street, the people who now carried themselves with a subtle shift, and he saw it in the way doors opened, in the way voices lowered, in the way Decisions were made without spectacle, and he knew that what had happened had not been a single moment, but the beginning of something quieter, something that would settle deeper with time. Boone placed the glass in front of the young woman, his hand steady, his eyes meeting hers briefly before moving away, and she nodded her thanks, not in surprise now, but in simple acknowledgement, and as she drank, the room did not react, did not pause, because this had become the new rhythm, the new normal, that no one had agreed to but everyone had accepted. Later, as the sun dipped low again, Boone stood alone for a moment behind the counter, the familiar space around him no longer defined by control, but by choice, and he looked at the empty glass in his hand, the light catching its surface just enough to reflect something back at him, not the man he had been, but the one he was becoming, shaped not by what he had said, but by what he had finally understood, that respect did not come from deciding who deserved it, but from recognizing that it was never his to withhold in the first place. The evenings in Red Hollow grew longer as the days passed, the kind of slow stretch where the light lingered just enough to soften the edges of things, and inside the saloon, the rhythm held steady, quieter now, more deliberate, as if every man who stepped through the door carried with him an unspoken understanding of how the room worked, not by rules written on walls, but by something that had settled deeper than that. Harold Boone moved through his work with a calm that had replaced the sharpness he once wore like armor, his hands steady, his voice measured, and though he said less, what he did say carried farther, not because it was louder, but because it no longer needed to prove itself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the first lanterns were lit, a traveler entered, dust on his coat, eyes scanning the room with the careful attention of someone who had seen enough towns to know how quickly judgment could fall. And he paused just inside, not stepping forward until he understood the space he had walked into. Boone noticed him, as he noticed everything now, but he did not rush the moment, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. He simply waited, allowing the man to take those few extra seconds, and when their eyes met, Boone gave a slight nod, nothing more, an invitation without pressure, and it was enough. The traveler stepped forward, his shoulders easing just slightly, and he ordered a drink, his voice steady but cautious, and Boone poured without comment, setting the glass down with the same care he had learned to carry into every motion, and the man accepted it with a quiet thanks that did not need to be louder to be heard. Around them, the room continued, conversations low, laughter present but restrained, no longer spilling over into something careless. And at one table, two men spoke in softer tones than they might have before, their words shaped not by fear, but by awareness, the kind that lingers after something has been seen clearly. Outside, the wind moved through the street, lifting small trails of dust that caught the lantern light, and Caleb Thornridge stood at the far end, his figure still, watching the town not as someone who needed to intervene, but as someone who recognized when a place had begun to adjust itself, when it had taken a step, however small, towards something better. He did not enter the saloon that evening, did not need to, because what had been set in motion did not require his presence to continue. It had already found its place within the people who carried it forward in their choices. Inside, Boone paused for a moment between tasks, his gaze drifting to the door, not expecting it to open, not waiting for anyone in particular, but acknowledging the path that had led him here, the moment that had changed not the town itself, but the way he stood within it. He reached for a glass, turning it slowly in his hand, watching the light move across its surface, and for the first time, there was no need to fill the silence, no need to shape the room with words, because the room no longer needed shaping. It held itself now, steady and quiet, built not on who was turned away, but on who was allowed to stand. And in that stillness, something enduring had taken root, something that would remain long after the memory of a single afternoon had faded into the dust. Time did not mark the change in Red Hollow with anything grand, no ceremony, no declaration, only the steady passing of days that carried small choices forward until they became something lasting. And Harold Boone came to understand that the quiet shift in his saloon was not a moment that had ended, but one that continued, unfolding in every exchange, every glance, every pause before a word was spoken. The room no longer belonged to his voice alone. It belonged to the space between voices, too. The way people entered without hesitation, to the way they were met without judgment, and though no one spoke of it directly, it lived there, present in ways that could not be undone. One late afternoon, as the sun leaned low over the town and painted the street in soft amber light, the saloon door opened again, not with tension this time, not with anticipation, but with something simpler, and a traveler stepped inside. A woman with dust on her boots and the look of someone who had seen enough roads to know when to expect resistance. And for a moment, the room watched, not in silence born of uncertainty, but in recognition, in memory of what had been and what had changed. Boone looked up from the counter, his hands still, his gaze steady, and there was no flicker of the man he had once been, no trace of the sharp edge that had once defined him, only a quiet awareness, a choice made without effort, and he nodded once. A simple acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any words he might have used before. "What can I get you?" he asked, his voice even, and the woman seemed to pause, not because she doubted him, but because she recognized something in the way the question was offered, something that did not demand explanation or permission. "Water," she said, her tone calm, and Boone turned without hesitation, reaching for a clean glass, the motion smooth, practiced, but now grounded in something steadier than habit. The sound of water filling the glass carried through the room, clear and familiar, and no one laughed. No one shifted uncomfortably, the moment passing as naturally as it should have all along. He placed the glass before her with care, meeting her eyes briefly, and she nodded in thanks, lifting it without urgency, without the weight of expectation that might have followed her in another time, another place. At a nearby table, a man leaned back slightly, watching the exchange, not with curiosity, but with quiet understanding, and then returned to his drink, because there was nothing unusual left to see. Outside, Caleb Thornridge stood at the edge of the street once more, his gaze drifting toward the saloon, not out of concern, not out of duty, but out of simple awareness. And he saw enough in that single moment to know that what had been set in motion had found its place, not through force, not through command, but through something far quieter, far stronger. He turned away without stepping inside, his boots carrying him down the road as the evening settled in, the town behind him holding its own, steady and unchanged in its shape, but different in its spirit. Inside, Boone watched the woman finish her drink, and as she set the glass down, he gave a small nod, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting anything in return, only marking the completion of something simple that now carried weight beyond itself. She stepped back toward the door, her presence leaving no disruption, no ripple, only a quiet continuation of what had already been built, and as she walked out into the fading light, the saloon remained, filled with voices that no longer needed to rise to be heard, with people who no longer needed to be measured before being served. Boone stood there for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly on the counter, his gaze steady, and in that stillness, there was no need for reflection, no need for words, because the lesson had already taken root, not in what had been said, but in what had been understood, and out on the open road, far beyond the reach of Red Hollow, Eleanor Whitlock rode on beneath a wide sky that asked nothing of her and gave everything in return, her path stretching forward without end, carrying with it the quiet truth that out here, justice did not always arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it arrived in silence, and when it did, it stayed.